Resources Manager here at Hamilton College. I'm here with our Arboretum staff, Krista Campbell, Charlie Gutterman, Sharon Rippey. We work behind the scenes to provide these informational talks for you. We're here today to introduce one of our own, Andrea Townsend. Andrea is an associate professor here at Hamilton College, and her concentration of research is in the American crow. And through my work with Andrea, I found out they really are quite fascinating, and I think you will too. So without further ado, we're going to get going. But if you have questions, you can go to the chat feature at the bottom of the screen and type your question in, and we will read those at the end. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrea. Andrea,
thanks, Don. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So I gave a similar talk at the other side in Utica right before the COVID epidemic occurred. So if some of this might be familiar if any of you went to that talk as well, but I'm excited to share it with another group of people. So the fascinating life of the American crow. It's a bird I've been working with since 2005. And once you've started working with crows, it's hard to go back and study anything else because it's kind of like a soap opera watching a crow. They're just, they're so interesting. So let me try sharing my screen. And all right, do you see some slides? There we go. See a PowerPoint?
Yes, quite visible.
Okay, so the title of my talk is Where Did All These Crows Come From? The Migration and Behavior of Clinton's Crows. And this was more of an appropriate title a couple of years ago. Don and I were just reflecting on how many fewer crows there are on campus now than there once were. And the reason for that, I guess, is good. I mean, it was really sad for me as a crow biologist, but we used to put all our compost on the Crane farm, which was right next to campus on, what's the name of that road? Stryker? No, Miller? Don's talking muted, but yeah, right near the physical plant. And there would be, what were you gonna say, Don?
I was gonna just say that we used to take it to Crane Farm on the corner of College Hill Road and Miller Road, yes.
Yeah, and so there would be a huge flock of 1,000 or so crows there every day eating Hamilton's compost. But now, unfortunately, or fortunately, we are sending our compost to a biodigester, which is being turned into clean energy. So yay for clean energy. And the sad news is that there are far fewer crows on campus. But you still might have seen crows locally in these huge flocks. So this is behind the New Hartford Library. So this is probably at 4 o'clock at night or in the evening. And they're doing what's called staging. So they're going to these, some trees on their way to their final roost. So you'll see them in some random trees, like along the side of the highway, and then they'll stream usually into Utica. So if anyone's looked up at the skies in Utica, sometimes there's a full moon and you'll see the crows streaming in from all directions into Utica. So, so you can still see that. Our Utica roost is about 8,000 birds. And so today what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the natural history of crows, which it's very, very interesting. They're very interesting birds. And then I will talk about where these local roosts come from. And we will talk about why crows come to Utica or any city. What's so special about the city for a crow? And then we'll talk about the intelligence of crows, which is something that one focus of my research right now. If I know some of my students are in here, you might say, hey, where's all the disease? I also do a lot with disease in crows. That's actually a big focus of my research. I'll talk about that a little bit, but I figured with COVID, you all didn't want to hear too much about disease right now. Although I am giving another talk on Wednesday actually about disease and social behavior. So it is part of my research. I'm just not going to focus on it so much today. All right, so let's talk about some natural history. So crows are what we call urban exploiters, and an urban exploiting species is a species that reaches higher densities in the urban landscape than in the surrounding rural landscapes. And there are actually very few species that are considered urban exploiters. You could probably list them if you were all in a crowd, I could say yell some out and you'd say like raccoon and rat and crow. So basically in any city that you go into, you will see a small number of species in high densities, and those are your urban exploiters. Crows are very family oriented. They're one of the few species of birds that are called the cooperative breeder. They breed in these family groups that are very similar in some ways to human family groups. So you'll have your mom and dad, and then you'll have kids from previous broods that stay home and help their mom and dad raise their younger brothers and sisters. And they can stay home for up to 7 years. And both the males and the females stay home and help their moms and dads. And so this is a tagged family group in Ithaca. I went to my grad school in Ithaca, New York, and so we used to tag them in Ithaca. I just banned them here on Clinton's campus because I felt like the tags were too conspicuous, although it didn't seem to bother the birds very much. So here are some of the behaviors that you'd see in the American crow, some of the cooperative behaviors. This is a video. Let me see what happens here. This is called allopreening, where they clean the feathers that are hard to reach on each other. They also have, this is allo feeding, it's called. So you have mom and dad feeding the nestlings, but you also have the older siblings feeding the nestlings. And then it's an extended family care or parental care. So here's a fledgling crow that's begging obnoxiously. If I had sound going, it's pretty loud and obnoxious. If any of you have heard this sound, which I find adorable, but some people who don't understand what's going on might find it annoying. But it's the baby begging its parent to be fed. And the funny thing about crows is that this bird could easily feed itself at this point, but it doesn't want to feed itself. It wants to be fed. And so sometimes they will keep begging for months and months. There's a lot of variation. Some will leave after a couple of months and go be independent, and some will stay home for a year and they'll continue begging even when they could perfectly well feed themselves. And one reason for this is that crows are a generalist feeder. They feed on a lot of different things, and they have to learn what is a safe thing to eat and what isn't. So there's a lot of learning going on in crows, and a lot of very smart organisms like humans and elephants, they have a long extended parental care period. And that's so that that enables them to learn from their parents about their environment. And so here's another view of that family group. And I'm showing you this again because here's another factoid about crows. And this has been a large part of my research that was actually a big surprise to me as a grad student. I was looking at paternity in the crow groups, and I found out that crows are actually highly inbred, which is a really rare thing. So there's very few laws of nature that most animals seem to obey. And one is don't inbreed. But crows do inbreed. So for example, in this family group, we have the dominant male and female, who incidentally, that's a uncle-niece pairing. And then these are their kids that they've produced for a whole bunch of years. So from 2007, 2004, 2002. But this guy from 2002 right here, in 2005, mated with his mom and produced this female. So that's his daughter sister in 2005. So there's layers of inbreeding and incest in these family groups. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but that has been a huge area of research for me, why they do that and what are the consequences of that. And one consequence of that, it's not a good thing to do, because one consequence of that is that they're more likely to get sick when they inbreed. And so it turns out that crows die of lots of different diseases. And the one you might have heard of is West Nile virus. It's an emerging infectious disease that wiped out lots of crows in 2002 when it emerged in this area, and they still die of it every year. They have no resistance to it. So one thing I've been studying is how disease affects the social behavior of these birds and their learning and memory. So we've been collecting these dead, whenever a crow dies, we collect it and we see why it died. And it turns out that there's lots of things they died from. So here's a partial list of some of the things that kills crows. So you can see this top one, for example, is poxviral dermatitis. And this crow, can you see my cursor? Just curious. Okay, good. This crow on the bottom has a poxviral dermatitis infection. It's like smallpox in humans, but this is the crow version, so it's not contagious to humans. But basically, organisms all have their own version of smallpox, and that's the crow version. It's pretty gross. And this one is fungal pneumonia, but a whole lot of things that kills a crow. And part of that is because they live a long time, like humans. They can live 20 years, so there's a long time for them to accrue these pathogens. They live in an urban landscape like us, which can be dirty and stressful. And also they eat a lot of different things, including they scavenge. So for all these reasons, and they're social. That's another reason that they have a lot of diseases. So social organisms in cities, eating a lot of bad food, all of these are recipes for getting sick. But finally, what I want to say about crows is that they are very, very smart. They are famously smart. So they do lots of cognitive tests on crows. So for example, they look at analogies. Can a crow tell that a fish is to water as a bird is to air? And the answer is yes. We used to think that only humans could do analogies. Well, crows can also do analogies. Crows can think into the future. So if you give them food and have them cache it, hide it, they will remember not only where they hid the food, but what the food was and when it expires or when it rots. So they'll only go for the food that they know is going to last longer, that won't perish if it's later on in time. So what else can they do? They can recognize individual human faces. There's lots of studies with masks. So crows, or if you wear a mask and you do something mean to a crow, it's going to remember that mask even years later. It's going to tell its kids about it, and your kids, the crow kids, are going to hate the person wearing that mask. So really, really kind of amazing, sophisticated cognition. And in some of these tests, what they do is they give the same tests to kids and non-human primates and crows. And in some of these tests, the crows outcompete the kids and the non-human primates. So they've got cognition that rivals primate cognition. To be fair, parrots also have really high cognition. Just throwing that out there. Okay, so the next question is where the local crows, where those huge roosts in winter, where are they coming from? Well, crows are unusual in another way, in which is that they are called a partial migrant. So in partially migratory species, you have a population, in one population where you have both resident individuals that stay around all year long, but there's also migrants that come from somewhere else. So here in this area, we have our year-round residents and breeders. So you're going to see crows at all times of year in Clinton. But in the breeding season, you're just going to see the territorial birds, so your local family group. And so your street in Clinton could have, I don't know if you're all from Clinton, I'm sure you're not all from Clinton, but if you've ever been to Clinton, a given street in Clinton could have 1 or 2 or 3 different family groups, and the same birds you'll see all the time, and they stay there year round. And then we have the winter migrants, and those are the ones that come from elsewhere and in the thousands, well, tens of thousands in some places, about 8,000 in this area, and spend the winter here. And let's see if this video worked. It didn't work when I was practicing. Oh, yeah, it does. Okay, so here is a roost that was on the UC Davis, University of California at Davis campus. So I was there, I was a professor there before coming to Hamilton. And this was a roost right in the middle of campus, which is very exhilarating for me as a crow biologist. So this was a 20,000 bird roost. And what they do is they spend the night in the roost, and then in the morning they go out in different directions. They kind of circle above and then they go off in different directions. And to look at this from another sort of a graphical perspective, here's the total number of crows at the roost over time. And you can see there is no roost in spring and summer. Those are just the residents and they're breeding. Although in the fall, they start forming local resident flocks of juvenile birds. It's really kind of cute. And then in late fall, then the migrants start arriving. And so by December, you see the full roost. So that's here again, about 8,000 birds. So where do the birds come from? Well, to answer this question, we did this in 2 different populations, in Davis, California, and in Utica, New York. And to do it, we had to catch birds and put satellite tags on them to see where they were going. So catching crows is really hard, and that's because they are so smart. So one way that you can catch crows is through these drop-in crow traps, which is kind of like a lobster trap. There's a ladder on the top that they can drop through, but they can't come back out because they'd have to close their wings, and you can't fly up with your wings closed. And it's really hard to catch them. They only will go in if they're really quite cold and miserable. And if it's pleasant out, they're not going to go in your crow trap. To get them to go in, we bait them with food from Hannaford. So one of my students, previous students, Rin, and I thought Caroline, is Caroline here? Thought I saw her. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so did you ever bait the crow trap?
I think I helped them like once or twice. It wasn't like totally involved with my thesis, so I didn't do it a ton, but I think I helped once or twice with it.
Yeah, it's pretty gross. So you go to Hannaford and you get all their food scraps that's about to expire, so the meat scraps, and then my students would go and have baiting, not parties, but anyway, they would get together and they would dump the old food scraps into these traps, and eventually the crows will agree to enter the trap when they get motivated enough. That's one way we catch them, but sometimes that doesn't work, especially if it's not winter. So another way you can catch them is using this remote, it's called a net launcher. So it has 4 rifle barrels and it shoots blanks and it's remote controlled. And to use this, you bait a little spot that's, I don't know, 30 meters away from the trap. And you bait that over the course of months. So the crows are used to coming down. And then on the morning of the trapping, you go and you hide. And then when the crows come down, you fire the net launcher. And this is going to be in slow motion. So you'll see it's really actually quite fast. There it goes. And then in theory, can you see that the net is going to land on that crow? I know in Zoom it's very pixelated. It's going to land on that crow. And then so that's another way. It's very exciting to catch crows. You can imagine how many times that works. Doesn't work very often, but if you're going to try to catch a crow, you have to be persistent. So to find out, we did catch crows and we put these tags on them. So we put 2 kinds of tags on them. We put on these satellite tags, and satellite tags are awesome because wherever the crow goes, whenever a satellite passes over the bird, it basically sends the data to your computer so you can find out where they went. And so we put about 30 of these tags on these birds. And then we also put GPS tags on the birds, and the GPS tags are even cooler because you can find out detailed information, really precise information about where the birds go. But the problem with a GPS tag is that you have to download the data. So you have to get in a certain distance of the bird to download the data. So here is some data from the GPS tags, and this was in Davis. So in the center here, we can see the communal roost. So you can see now it's daytime and now it's nighttime, and they're all going to the roost again. Each of the different colors indicates a different bird. So what they're doing is they're coming into the roost in an urban area, and then they're going out during the day to the surrounding rural farm fields, or if there's a compost pile, they will go to these different places during the day. And one thing that's cool about this is that you can see that certain birds go to the same place every day, like bright pink always goes north and purple always goes to the west. So we haven't done GPS stuff in the local area yet, but that's something that I'm hoping to do in the near future. But here are some data based on satellite tags in our area. So here's Clinton, and each color is a different bird. And I only put a couple of birds here because it was just too crazy. But you can see here is the area of the communal roost in Utica. Does anyone know what this area is? Where is that in Utica?
I don't know.
Anybody?
Is that down near the?
Sorry, what?
Down near the Solid Waste Authority?
Yes. Good job, Don. So yeah, so that is actually the train station / sewage treatment plant. So sewage treatment plant road So you might wonder, okay, of all the places in Utica that a crow could go, why go to the sewage treatment plant? Well, that's not their first choice in Utica. So actually their first choice was Genesee Street. So this 8,000 bird roost was perched on Genesee Street that year, and they were, pooping all over the Munson Williams Proctor and the Stanley Theater and the library. So that didn't go over too well. And there are ways to move roosts along. So I think this was from Rochester, but it's the same principle. We used it here in Utica as well. So what they do is they fire pyrotechnics, fireworks and lasers, and then you can just shift the crows along. So they don't leave, they'll just go to the neighboring neighborhood. So they kept moving them along. I think they went to the crows went to the hospital. That wasn't cool. So they kept moving them along. They went to a residential senior living area. That didn't go over well, so they moved them all along again, and finally they ended up in the sewage treatment plant / train station, and no one cared. So that's where they spent the winter. I don't actually know where they spent the winter this year. Has anyone seen the big roost in Utica? Oh, Uticans this year? Yeah, there was the year, a couple years later, they spent at the library. So I'm not sure where they're at this year, but it's probably the train station. So that's where they are throughout the winter months. Well, where do they go? Where do they come from? Well, to answer this question, we use that satellite telemetry data. And so this again was in California and in New York, but I'm going to focus on the New York data. So here we are, here's Syracuse on the map, and you can see these are all different birds in these different colors. You can see that they're all going to Canada. That's where the crows go. So they basically fly up through the Adirondacks into Montreal, and then they follow the St. Lawrence River north. And then they'll stop off in different breeding sites along the way. And Dave Tewksbury turned this into a little animation for me. So you can see here this bird spent, so here's the line of migration, the flight path of this bird. And let's watch it again. So here you can see it spent a few days in Montreal, but then it moved pretty quickly, didn't stop much at all till it got to its breeding grounds, which here in Rimouski. I think that's how Anna told me it's pronounced, in Canada. And if you want to see what its territory looked like, so this is what its territory looked like in Canada. It's a much more rural landscape than in Utica. Okay, so where do the roosts come from? They come from Canada. And so why do they come to Utica, or why do they come to any city? So essentially, pretty much any city at this latitude, Davis, California, or Rochester, or Utica, or New York City, within a certain range of latitudes, but right around 38 to 42, you're going to have your big crow roost. So why do they come to cities? Why do they come to cities at this latitude? Well, I don't know the answer to the latter question. If I was a crow, I would keep going south personally, but the Canadian crows come to a city in about this latitude. So what is it with cities and crows? Well, there's lots of reasons why we think that crows are attracted to urban areas, particularly in winter. And the first one is that they tend to be warmer. So you might have heard of the urban heat island. It's this phenomenon where when you're in the middle of a city, it's much warmer than in the surrounding rural areas. It can be 20 degrees warmer in the middle of the city than outside of it. So you might have noticed as you're driving into Utica or any city, there's a lot less snow in the city center than outside of it, which I guess is good for plowing. But the reason for it is that all that impervious surface, that pavement, those buildings absorb heat and melt the snow and keep things warmer. And so it's easier living as far as climate inside an urban center. And there's also the idea of safety in numbers. So if you bring all these birds together, you're going to have greater vigilance so that you will be able to see when predators are around. And also if a predator does come, you're less likely to be the one to get eaten than if you were all by yourself. And then finally, protection from hunters. So in about 1950, it became illegal to shoot crows in the urban areas. And so right around that time, crows started moving in to urban areas. So the urban crow is a relatively newish phenomenon. Crows have always been associated with people, but not so much in cities. But as soon as we stopped killing them in cities, they moved in and their numbers have increased and increased, and their populations overall increased since the 1950s. Of course, as Dawn knows, we can still shoot them outside of the cities. And so, it's probably no surprise why they come in here for refuge. So another reason that a city or living near people could be good for a crow is food subsidies. So imagine being a crow in winter, like right now outside, and not having human food subsidies. What would you eat? I mean, when I try to imagine what a crow would eat in this kind of weather right now with all this snow, it's hard to imagine. You might think roadkill, well, that's still a human food source, really. But in an urban area, if you have access to a dumpster or a compost pile, it's amazing the amount of food they can have. And it's high calorie, it's easy to get, it's reliable. But the question then is, well, is it good for them? So there's also an idea that urban areas can draw certain animals into the urban area, but the urban area might not actually be good for them. And that goes for urban food and human food as well. Sure, there's a lot of it, but is it good for these birds? So does it have, for example, the same micronutrients as worms, one of their most common natural food items? And the answer is no. Other folks have looked at like protein and calcium, and there's more in a worm than in human foods, human refuse. But what I focused on and my students focused on is cholesterol in these birds. And so the reason we focus on cholesterol is that there have been a few other studies showing that cholesterol levels tend to be higher in urban animals than in rural animals. So for example, they've shown that house sparrows have higher cholesterol levels in urban areas than in relatively rural areas. Likewise, this is the San Joaquin kit fox, same phenomenon, higher cholesterol in urban areas, better condition too, actually. And there's some fun examples, like this is the Bahamian rock iguana and sea turtles. They tend to have higher cholesterol in touristed areas than areas without tourists because tourists feed them, presumably. So what we wanted to know is, okay, does urbanization increase crow cholesterol levels, and is it because they're eating human foods? So we did this again in these two populations. So in Davis, I was looking across an urban to rural gradient, comparing cholesterol levels with levels of urbanization. And then in Clinton, we were doing this experimental supplementation and with cheeseburgers. And that's what I'm going to focus on right now, tell you about. So this is work that I did with one of my thesis students, Hannah Staub. And so what we did was we supplemented some of our crow families. We supplemented them with McDonald's cheeseburgers because, that's readily available here in Clinton. And we had 10 supplemented family groups and 19 unsupplemented family groups. And what Hannah did was she brought 3 cheeseburgers to each group each day, and she would put the cheeseburgers under the tree, the nest tree, during the breeding season. And she'd do this 5 or 6 days a week. And the crows were thrilled with this experiment. So they were very willing to participate. So they really got to know Hannah, and they would just come right over. So you'd put the cheeseburger down. Within a few seconds of moving away, they come down, they grab the cheeseburger, and they take it away with them. And there's some variation in what they do with it. Some of them will eat it right away, and some of them will cache it. But a lot of times they'll bring it to their babies too. And then Hannah, after about 3 weeks of the supplementation, Hannah and I, we got the birds, and then she would take blood samples from the birds and look at the cholesterol levels of the supplemented versus unsupplemented crows. And so just cutting to the chase of what we found, we did indeed find that urban crows, so along this urban to rural gradient, the more urban crows had higher cholesterol levels than the rural crows. And that, yes, if you feed them cheeseburgers, you can elevate their cholesterol levels. We also found that crows that had higher cholesterol levels were heavier for a given body size. So in other words, they were chubby crows. So in ecology talk, that's called being in good condition when you're heavy for a given body size, when you're chubby. And I'm sure there's some point at which that's not a good thing, but it tends to be kind of a good thing if you're a baby crow to be a heavy baby crow. So this study actually got a lot of attention in the popular press, as Vij will attest. So city crows have high cholesterol because they eat fast food, cholesterol in the city. And the question I got from all of these reporters was, is this bad? And the truth is that we don't know, but it doesn't appear to be bad. So we were also measuring things like survival of these birds and disease and all sorts of health outcomes. And we could find no negative health outcomes associated with eating cheeseburgers or having high cholesterol levels. So it might not be the equivalent to having high cholesterol or elevated cholesterol in humans. There's, if you look at lab studies where they show a negative effect of cholesterol on a bird, the levels are an order of magnitude higher to cause disease in a bird. So yes, their cholesterol levels are higher, but it actually might be an index of something good happening for the birds. And also I should point out that we do necropsies on all these crows, and they're certainly not dying of heart disease. Most of what kills a crow, as you saw from that list, which I'm sure you all remember, is infectious disease. So there's very little chronic degenerative diseases like you'd see in a person that's eating a lot of cheeseburgers. Okay, so why do the crows come to Utica or any city? Well, there's lots of potential reasons for a bird to come to a city. So it's warmer, resources of food, protection from predators. And so, you still might wonder, well, why Utica? Why not somewhere farther south? And that's an open question. But it's also an interesting time to ask questions like that because things are changing as the climate changes. It's going to be interesting to see if these birds shift their overwintering grounds and change their behavior as in response to changing climates. Maybe they won't actually have to leave their breeding areas if they're getting milder winters farther north, which is something that also has attracted some popular press. Okay, and finally, I want to end by talking about crow intelligence and city smarts. So the overarching idea, the question is, okay, are urban birds smarter than rural birds? There's some evidence that in raccoons, for example, urban raccoons can solve problems better than their rural counterparts. But so here's some questions. Why are crows so smart? And what factors might affect their cognitive abilities? So some of the factors that we are thinking about include disease, urbanization, migration, and inbreeding. So all of the things that I was talking about before that make a crow special. So how do these different features affect their cognitive abilities? And so to test this, we need to come up with all these different testing paradigms. So here we see a crow that's about to solve a memory test. And I'm sorry if this is pixelated on Zoom, that's just Zoom's thing. It's going over and it has to remember that there's food hidden in this hole right here, this box. And of course, this crow, of course, remembers that and goes right for it, no problem. So one of the tricks here is trying to come up with a test that's actually hard enough so that it actually is a challenge for them. But that's not scary. They don't like scary things. So, and for crow, many things are scary. So, oh, here's another test, a problem solve. This one's a problem solving test. There is a food item, a piece of bacon on a string, and that bird had to pull the string to get the bacon out. What could be next? This is another version of that. So these are strings hanging down with chunks of bacon, and the bird has to pull it up, foot over foot, has to step on it to get that string to stay put and keep pulling. And hopefully you can see that this bird is very good at it, solved it right away. Although there's a lot of variation in how well they solve these tests. Some birds will swing that bacon back and forth, and then it'll wrap around the bird, and some birds just will never be able to solve it. Some birds try hard and some birds don't. This is it's an associative learning trial where the bird had to learn that the food is always going to be either on one side or associated with one color or another color. And this bird totally remembers. Okay. So it's been interesting designing batteries of tests for the birds to solve. One of my students right now is doing a version of Aesop's fable. So so if you remember the fable, the bird wants some water, but it's in a vase and it's too low. So to get the water, it has to put rocks in the water jug and the water rises till it can drink. So I don't know if I could figure out that task, to be honest with you. And so they have shown that a number of different corvids can solve Aesop's fable, but it's not like immediately. You have to give them some steps, some stages. So right now, no one's ever tried that with American crows. So that's one thing that we're doing right now. But anyway, we're trying to create all these tests with which we can characterize how well they solve problems, their spatial memories, associative learning, and social learning. And social learning is something that's pretty interesting. How much do they learn from other crows? And to do this, we have enlisted the help of our aviary crows. So here is one of our aviary crows. This is Poe. And we hand raised 3 crows to help us with these social learning trials. So that's one of my daughters feeding it. They're extremely tame, and they're very, as I said, family oriented. So they think of me as their mom, and they think of the people that helped raise them, like my kids and some undergrads that helped me with this project, as their older siblings. So they remember us and they are excited to see us. And it's really obvious when a crow is excited to see you. So here is a very excited crow. I'm singing. Hopefully you cannot hear that, right? No singing is heard. Good. Okay, good. All right. So I'm singing to Pippin and he's singing back. And you can see that wing wiggle. That is like, I'm so excited. So it's really fun to work with them. Here's, they're very inquisitive. They'll go through your pockets. This is Asher. He's very smart, our smartest. Well, I don't know if he's our smartest crow, but he's definitely our bravest crow. He solves everything first. And here's allopreening Pippin. So besides the fact that they're super fun to watch and just hang out with, we use these aviary crows. We give them some cognitive tests and we video it. So here's Poe solving a test where you have to pull a lid off of a container to get a food reward. And she solved it. We got a video of it. And here is Asher. He's solving this test where there's a tube and he has to pull 2 levers to get the food reward. So there he's pulled 1 lever and there he pulled another. So he got his food item. And so we video that. And then what we do is we play it to a wild caught crow and see if, okay, we give them, the wild caught crows, the same tasks. Half of the crows, we show the video of this Asher solving it, and half of the crows we don't. So here's a crow that seemed very keen on, here's the TV in the front that's sitting in that chair. And this crow, he just pulled 1 of the levers out. Now he's just pecking at the glass, which is obviously not helpful. You can see hopefully that he's now watching the video closely. Getting some tips. Flying up, looking at the video. Still not solving it. Checking out the video again. And there he goes, he solved it. So seeing the extent to which watching another bird, even by TV, will help them learn. So that's social learning. And you can, and I'll show you that not all of the birds are so interested. So here's another bird sitting on his perch and we're playing the same video and here's that learning trial. This bird could care less about the whole thing. It has no interest in the trial. It has no interest in the TV. It's just sat there the whole time. So there's a lot of variation, not only in how well they solved it, You know, some birds tried it and couldn't solve it, but also in their willingness to try. So what are we doing with these data? Well, we're looking at how cognitive abilities vary with the birds themselves, or characteristics of the birds. So for example, we're comparing cognitive abilities of sick and healthy birds, and migrants and residents, and urban and rural crows, and extroverts and introverts, and inbred and outbred crows. So there's a whole lot of things that we're interested in. And these are the kinds of things like my students will take one of these each and try to address these questions. But I just want to talk about one right now because it's one that I'm actually working on as we speak. And I was actually analyzing these data yesterday. So Dawn, if I looked distracted in our meeting, it's because I was thinking about this so hard. Okay, so the sick and healthy. So the basic question is, does having an infection impact your cognitive performance? Now, you can imagine if you're a Hamilton student and you have COVID, knock on wood, that's probably going to affect your cognitive performance. You know, it might, all you're going to want to do is basically crawl into your bed, pull your covers up, and not engage in cognitive tasks. You know, cognitively challenging tasks, just intuitively, we could say that you're probably not going to be up to your peak cognitive performance. And there is some data from humans that this is the case, but there's basically nothing from wild animals looking at how infection or being sick affects their cognitive performance. And that's kind of a huge gap because obviously being sick has lots of other consequences, like for your survival. But if it affects your cognition as well, that could have other consequences that we haven't even thought about for wild animals. So in this study, I've been looking at Campylobacter jejuni. It's a foodborne pathogen. It causes diarrhea in humans. In crows, it doesn't cause diarrhea, but we find that birds that have Campylobacter are in poor condition and don't survive as well as birds that don't have Campylobacter. So, and about half of them just naturally carry it. So what we did was we compared the cognitive performance of infected crows versus healthy crows. This is the percentage of tests that were solved. And you can see here that healthy crows solved more tests than the infected crows. In fact, in some tests, like the string pulling test, every single healthy crow solved that string pulling test, whereas very few of the infected crows solved the string pulling test. And if you dig a little deeper, it's because the infected ones didn't try. So, and you could also see that the infected ones were just far less active, less exploratory. They didn't move around their enclosure as much. They just didn't feel like it. And sometimes they would try, but then they just give up really quickly. So there's definitely a difference in cognitive performance between the sick and infected individuals. So sick and healthy individuals. So that has been very interesting to us. And so we're actually right now thinking about ways we can do this in the field. So giving cognitive tests to wild free living birds and then assessing their health status. So you can basically give them a string with a piece of food on it, see if they solve it, and then collect a poo, and then see if they had Campylobacter. So essentially seeing if this translates to a field situation. So that's something that I'm thinking about working on this summer. But there's also all of these other questions that we're still interested in. And with that, that's it. That's all I wanted to share with you today. And I can see there's a lot in the chat, so I am happy to take questions if there are some.
Sure, a question.
Hey, Ernest.
Hi there. What about age-related cognitive ability? Do older birds, having learned more during a lifetime, are they better at solving tests?
That's a great question. So the short answer is that we have put age in. You can't age them very well. So you can tell a hatchier bird from an older bird, but you can't really tell much more than that. And that we haven't seen a strong or any relationship yet between age and learning. But also older birds might be more fearful So there's confounding factors in these cognitive tests. You might consider having Campylobacter as a confounding factor. So it's not just can you actually do it, but are you willing to do it, and are other things going on? So we're teasing all that apart, but certainly age is something that we need to think about.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There's a few questions here, Andrea, but I think you might have already answered them during your presentation. I guess there was a question here about the cholesterol. Have you determined if that is a good or bad or a detriment to the crows?
Yeah, so there's the good and bad cholesterol in humans, and I've talked to vets about that, and apparently that doesn't apply in the same way to birds. So that's a great question. Is there the LDL versus HDL cholesterol? And the short answer is we don't know. But that principle, the LDL, HDL, good, bad cholesterol, doesn't seem to apply to birds in general. And we haven't been able to find any costs of having elevated cholesterol in these birds.
Nice. Okay.
So we have a raised hand, Lona.
I am. And so we spent a little time last summer trying to befriend our neighborhood crows, and they would not. We put out tasty things for them, and they'd come. They certainly come by now and then, but they would not come down to our treats. We don't know if it's because we've got a dog. So it sounds like we should figure out if there's a tree in the neighborhood where they go often. That would be a better way to make friends with them than in our own yard because of the dog.
Yeah, the dogs is definitely going to be an issue. The easiest way to make friends with your neighborhood crow is as you're pulling out of your driveway, throw a handful of peanuts out your window, because they are not threatened at all by a car, and they like foraging on the side of the road. So
you can do that.
Yeah, so that's, my crows come to me every time I leave my driveway, and they're very insistent. They want their peanuts, but they won't come into my yard because of my dogs.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right, Andrea, there's another question here. Is there a maximum number of crows that will go to one of the social roosts? Sounds like you've been 8,000, 20,000. It doesn't seem like there's a maximum number.
Yeah, well, I imagine the maximum number is set by the local resources. So I've heard of roosts that are 30,000, 50,000. The Auburn crow roost is enormous. So Auburn, New York, they hate their crows, and every year they have a crow shoot, an annual crow shoot. I guess it's outside of the city limits. It couldn't be in the city limits. And then one year they actually used dynamite to blow up their crows. But I think that their roost must be at least, I'm going to go with 30,000, but it must be an enormous roost if it's causing that much.
Right. Now here's another question I think you've already answered, but I feel it's appropriate to ask. Why do you keep some of the crows in the aviary?
Well, we have two kinds of crows. Sometimes we have the wild caught ones, and then we'll just bring them in for a few days and give them some cognitive tests and release them. And then we have the hand-raised crows. And those birds were crows that weren't going to make it, honestly, if they were in the wild. So they had pneumonia. One of them had a blockage to its throat. So these are birds that wouldn't make it in the wild. And actually, we might get a few more from a local rehabilitator to bring in some more crows to the aviary. I'm a little leery of doing that. We want this to be a good place for them, so I don't want to overcrowd them. And then crows are very friendly with each other and their family, but I have to be really careful about other crows I bring in, and I just want them all to get along. So, but yeah, so it's kind of like a crow rescue in a way, and it's also good for the students, because a lot of the students don't have the time in the length of their senior thesis to watch birds in the wild or to get these kind of data from wild birds.
Another question here.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's in the slideshow, the birds going back and forth from Utica to Clinton, were the orange lines just one crow?
Yeah, that was probably a resident Clinton crow. So another thing that I didn't mention is that the resident birds will also join these huge flocks in the wintertime. Some of them stay on their territory at night, but a lot of them will go join the migrant roost. So that was probably one of our residents so he always came back to Clinton during the day to say hi to his family or her family, and then spent the night at the Utica Roost.
I have a follow-up question to that. So it looked like some of the lines did come near my house. And we often have like 3 or 4 crows around here. So I was wondering, was that just, but it went a lot of other places too. Would it be just visiting the ones that are mostly here, or, how does this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're a territorial bird and then all of a sudden a migrant comes into your area, what do? I guess it depends on how many migrants come in. So that bird probably wasn't by itself. It was probably with a flock of 20 other migrant birds, and they are passing through. The resident birds can't do much about a 20-bird flock of migrants that are passing through. So they probably didn't do much. If it was just one other resident bird from a neighboring territory, they'd fight it off and keep it out of its territory. But they can't really resist when you have a huge 28,000 bird flock total. There's not much the residents didn't do about it.
It would be interesting to see your that map with all the birds.
Yeah.
And load in on, my area. Have that available anywhere?
No, so I'm the only one tagging crows in this way. The tags cost $3,000 each. So, right now I don't have that kind of money, or we're applying for money to put some more tags on them because it is information that you can't get any other way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Maggie Doolin, would you like to unmute and ask your question, or I can read it for you?
Sure, I can unmute. Thanks for the great talk, Andrea. I had a question about the implication of crow roosting sites on other animals. I was just wondering if when you have these big congregating sites, do they have impacts on other birds or small mammals, and will they hunt? Like, are they smart animals that hunt when they're in packs, or are they pretty much only scavengers?
They're pretty much only scavengers, and the places that they pick for these roosts, again, they tend to be parking lots. That's their preferred habitat, is the parking lot. And then there was the sewage treatment plant. They're right over the train. So they're picking places that not many other species would want to be. They're not the pleasant habitat, except humans, So the only animal I think that they really affect by their roosting in a negative way is probably humans. Another group has looked at nitrogen and so for all the feces, and they find that yes, indeed, the area under these roosts are fertilized, and so that could promote growth of plants underneath the roosts. So there could be a positive cascade for plant growth if there happens to be dirt underneath these roosts. They're not predators, and so they're not going to, suppress the native rodent community or any other community. Well, okay, I take that back. They depredate nests. So in the springtime, they will kill nestlings and eggs. They eat the eggs of other birds, but that has nothing to do with these big roosts. Those are your resident crows. So that's a much smaller number of crows that are affecting their prey species, but they're more of a generalist scavenger that eats worms and an occasional egg than a predator. And then another effect that they might have, though, is I'm sure that there are owls that are specializing on the roosts. So a lot of times if you go under the roosts, you'll find heads of crows, and you find that when an owl has gotten a crow, because what they do is they take off the head and they leave the head behind when they eat the crow. So you can see evidence that owls have been hanging out around the roost and feeding off of some birds.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. John Pederesi, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, sir. Andrea, tremendous presentation. I really enjoyed it. I live in the village. I have a comment, I think, rather than a question. I live in the village of New Hartford, very across the parking lot from St. John the Evangelist Church. And we used to have a stand of a couple dozen huge spruce trees along the parking lot. And for a long time, I'd be awakened at maybe 5:30 in the morning by all this noise, and those trees were loaded with crows, loaded with crows. One day, one of my neighbors went out and shot one, and no more crows. They went down to Genesee Street
Mhm.
in front of the old Presbyterian church, First Presbyterian Church, and the trees down there were loaded, and the sidewalks were absolutely white.
Yeah.
But you talked about the roost in Utica, and you know, for many years my job was covering hockey at the auditorium for the Observer Dispatch, and I'd walk up Liberty Street about a half a mile, and it would be 6:30. You know, it was dark. One day I felt or heard all this fluttering, and I looked to my left, and this tree was outlined. I don't know if it was against the moon or the hotel lights from the Hotel Utica, and there were easily 100 birds in that tree.
Yeah.
As I walked down, every tree was absolutely loaded with birds. And
Were you
then when I got
exhilarated? Yeah.
by the Smith Packing Company, there's a big open area there, torn down buildings. It was covered with snow. In about every inch of that field was covered with birds.
Yep.
So I counted the trees coming back. There were 60 trees. And I swear there are 100 birds in every tree. And, you know, I researched a little bit, and part of it said they like the heat. They like the light to some degree as protection from predators and so on. And I don't know how long that lasted, but I want to tell you, there were thousands upon thousands of birds from Genesee Street down to just about the auditorium.
Yep.
And I don't know how long that lasted. Now you say that they're down by the sewage treatment plant, but it was an awesome, I'm sure it was annoying in some ways, but it was a awe-inspiring sight. It really, and feeling, really and truly.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I have a great appreciation of the birds. And by the way, I have seen crows pick nestlings out of nests more than once. So they'll do whatever they have to do to get along.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is a great presentation.
Thank you, John. Yeah, actually, you know what? I take it back. I do know where the crows are this winter because I dropped my daughter off at Utica Dance. They're right at Utica Dance in the Munson William Proctor, or they were a few weeks ago. They move around a little bit, but yeah, if you go to the Munson Williams and you look up at those trees, they're just, you know, like ice cream cones of crow. It's amazing to look at.
So I think we're about at the witching hour. So I want to make sure you know that we do have another Arboretum talk coming up March 20th at 10 a.m. and it's with Professor of Art, Rebecca Murtaugh. She's going to talk about foraging for vibrant colors. And Charlie will put that in the chat. It's the same Zoom link, 10 a.m. on the 20th. And if you want to get a reminder for future talks, please put your email into Charlie as well so she can do that. And just really, Andrea, thank you so much. I mean, I know all of us have so many stressors in our lives. It's just fascinating to, you know, hear all of your work, really good work, and spend such a pleasant time with you learning about this. So really just thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks everyone else for coming. Thanks to my students. Happy to see you here too.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you. Fabulous.
Bye.
Thank you.